Okay, welcome everyone. I am Susan Sons, Deputy Director of the ResearchSOC, and this is Wade Craig, who is joining us from the world of NRAO. We're here to talk to you about ResearchSOC from a technical perspective. We do a lot of talks that are about your security posture and your security program and things like that. This is a chance to learn a little bit about what is the experience of onboarding and working with a ResearchSOC service from a technical perspective, and what does it do to your world? So Wade, anything else you want to say to kick it off, or do I get to start the Grand Inquisition?
Hi, folks. Glad you're all here.
Wade was really nice to do this for us. NRAO onboarded to ResearchSOC about 18 months ago now. Is that right?
Let's see. It was, yeah, that sounds about right. It was at the end of 2019, just before the pandemic hit. It was awesome.
Yeah, I remember you were the first ones we couldn't travel to, and it was an oh my gosh moment.
Yep.
So first of all, can you give us a brief description of the services you guys are actually getting from ResearchSOC?
Sure. We're handling, we're getting the CISO as a service from the ResearchSOC, and we're also leveraging the OmniSOC for the 24/7, constant monitoring.
Yeah. You guys also have the vulnerability detection service, I believe, and you're using that CISO services, CISO advisory. Have you guys spun up any of the honeypots through our Stinger program yet?
We have. We spun up one honeypot. It's external. It sees a lot of traffic. Sends that all over to Duke, and it's been pretty interesting. Just seeing what it's picking up. We're also in the process, in conjunction with Rob at OmniSOC's, about to stand up some honey tokens on the inside of our network for Active Directory.
By the way, audience, you're welcome to interrupt us with questions, throw things in chat. This is really informal for most of you who haven't noticed. That's why it's called a roundtable. We're not here to do formal presentations. Our goal is to give you all interesting information that might be of use to you. So Wade, one of the things that I hear a lot from NSF facilities and other small to medium organizations that are thinking of jumping on board with, okay, we know we need 24/7 monitoring. We're going to either need to build this in-house or hire it out. What are sort of the things that you put in place before you looked to either build or buy in a SOC?
So when I joined the NRAO, it was post an engagement with Trusted CI. They basically came in and did a helpful, friendly audit. Although they don't call it an audit, it's more of an engagement. One of the major takeaways, findings of that engagement was you need to staff up. At the time, my manager was wearing both the information security officer hat along with sort of the security specialist hat, combined with a whole lot of other functional duties as well as management. And it was basically, he had 1/3 of his time, more or less, devoted to cybersecurity, which is, as we all know, is not nearly enough. So one of the biggest takeaways was we need to staff up. And, long story short, now I'm here. And when we came in, we had, so I've inherited a lot of things. We tend to do things more from the, how can we do it at a lower cost? As we all know, security is extremely expensive. And you often don't see that return on investment. In fact, you shouldn't see a lot of that return on investment because it's supposed to be doing what it's supposed to be doing, as opposed to, if you see somebody get in after you put, a lot of money into something, then that's a problem. So one of the things I came here and did was take a look around at what we've got. What are we doing for monitoring? What are we doing for this and that and the other? And then how can we make it better? And about that same time, ResearchSOC kind of availed themselves. Here's a neat, idea of doing this, and I thought it aligned perfectly with what we need. And one of the biggest things, I spent a couple decades in the pharma industry, and one of the biggest needs that I thought that we had here was, for a security event, monitoring device. So rather than spending a couple $100,000 on a SIEM device, it seemed to be much easier and get us going a lot faster to partner with the ResearchSOC, primarily for that 24/7. That's what I saw as the biggest, the biggest immediate value and need that we had. And due to some issues on our end, we run Zeek. One of our Zeek systems was considerably underpowered and was seeing, about a half of the packets it should have. We had to get a little shoring up on our end before we got everything fully going. And of course, as Susan indicated, the pandemic put a bit of a spin on things in that regard. But that was one of the biggest, value adds I found. And the way I look at it, we can either spend the money on a SIM device and then devote myself pretty much full time to care and feeding and tuning and rule building and all that sort of stuff. If you have actually ever spent any time with the SIM device, you know that it's not a whole lot of fun. It takes a particular type of personality type to want to spend time doing that. Or you can leverage someone like the ResearchSOC, who has a lot of those rules already in place. They've already got Zeek feeds ready to go. We basically bounce a copy of our Zeek feed to a Kafka node, and off it goes to the ResearchSOC.
Okay, great. So I know that we did a lot of work with you to get your feeds up and running, and that's always a process when we take on a new client. We've had clients who have no monitoring before we show up. We've had clients who have monitoring that is okay, but not getting the feeds it should, or maybe not placed correctly on the network. And we've had, you guys, I think, were one of the more mature few that we've had, because you had monitoring. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't where you wanted it to be, but you had a good start there and something we could build from. What do you think the important factors for spinning up on some of the other things that we did with you were? What did you need, for example, before we could start doing your vulnerability scanning and your honeypots?
Well, we mostly guidance and CPU cycles, personal CPU cycles around things, because there's just so much going. The idea is you have to prioritize what are you going to get the biggest bang for the buck from to start with. And the honeypots from that standpoint are really cool. They're kind of a gee whiz sort of thing that I like, but they're not necessarily something that's going to give us the immediate sort of return on investment like 24/7 monitoring will, and alerting, and the VAS, open VAS scans and that sort of stuff. And we do a lot of those scans ourselves. We've got a commercial product that allows us to leverage a hosted scan engine that's not on our network, so I can scan as if somebody were actually looking at us. So it's a lot of, I'm a big fan of trust but verify. So having multiple eyes on things and seeing multiple results of different scanning engines and different scanning organizations allows me to get reality around what our actual vulnerability looks like. You see this, this and that as false positives. Okay, well, if I see false positives from two different things, then it's probably a false positive, as opposed to, well, maybe the scan engine just doesn't like something or something along those lines.
So in your day-to-day work, obviously you still have a lot of responsibilities beyond monitoring and response. What do you think are the things that are not specifically monitoring activities that are easier to do now that you don't have to worry about whether the network's monitored?
So incident response is one of thoothose things. If we were to have an intrusion, one of the nice things we can do is I can call you and say, hey, we need help. And that immediately, spools up. We haven't had to leverage that, thankfully, knock on wood. But it's lovely to have that there. We have had a couple, cases where a user's gotten phished, and then the attacker has gotten, the email credentials and that sort of stuff, and logged into our webmail system. So unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which way you want to look at it, I'm a fan of lemonade, so I tend to look at it fortunately. Our incident response process is actually pretty mature. But I love having, the ResearchSOC in my back pocket in the event that we have something that's, escalated that we can't necessarily handle ourselves. Like, let's say, for instance, the log4j thing, or the huge exchange vulnerability that was percolating about a year ago. We jumped on that straight away. We patched our exchange box. It was an all-night sort of endeavor. But we managed to stem any sort of, actual active compromise, which I know a lot of people weren't able to do. That was a really bad one out there. But, had we had some sort of exchange compromise, I feel certain that, I could have leaned on the research SOC to say, hey, how do we go about making this better?
Mhm. That's awesome. So I know that you guys have done a really good job of speeding up your patch tempo.
Yes.
When we gave you, hey, here's a list of vulnerabilities 18 months ago, the difference between then and now and how fast those actually get remediated is incredible. Can you talk about some of the things that had to happen at NRAO to make that possible?
Yeah, it's prioritization, really, and visibility up the management chain. You have to have management that understands and values information security. All it takes is one endpoint, being behind on its patches, not reporting in properly, something along those lines, and now you've got a compromise, and who knows, you've got something further on beyond that.
Mhm.
And so part of that was management buy-in. Hey folks, we've got a problem here. These machines haven't been patched in 2 years. Why are we not patching these? Part of our job as information security analysts is to shine the flashlight in the places that people don't like the flashlight being shown, underneath the stove, behind the fridge, and that sort of thing. We have to look for those big dust bunnies and things. So part of it was that, and I'm very fortunate here that my entire management chain, all the way to the very top, values information security. Because we're ultimately a data company. Our goal is to collect data and then give away that data. But we also need to keep that data secure and all that sort of thing while we've got it, while it's while it's under our purview. So from the patch standpoint, a large part of it was just getting that visibility and getting that reality around it, and then getting buy-in from management and the various team leads and such to go, okay, we need to take this a little more seriously than we have been. And it also comes at a cost of well, if we're doing patching and having to catch up from patches, then what other things operationally are we not doing?
Mhm.
So it becomes a prioritization thing. But the upside of that is, once you get a handle on your patching and you get a good process in place, then you don't necessarily have to spend as many cycles on it, because it becomes just habit. And I like having things I like good habits.
Me too. Have you built any automation to support that so that patching can come at less of a cost in your time?
I don't handle personally a lot of the patching myself. I have people for that. But no, we've got, on the Windows side of things, we've got SCCM, and on the Red Hat side of things, we've got automation there. So yes, the patches from that standpoint get just released and then handled and pushed out. Now we use a commercial product that verifies the patches, because SCCM is really good at just blasting patches out, and they're deployed with a somewhat matter of faith. Okay, well, we think that the patches got deployed and that's about it. But we've got a commercial product that then verifies that patches have been pushed out or have been actually applied and didn't bork upon receipt and that sort of thing. So that happens.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's great that you've invested in that. I think one of the frustrations that I see with patch tempos at some of our other clients and organizations that aren't our clients is that they're still trying to do it manually. And when something big hits, like Log4Shell, Log4j, they're running around trying to figure out where things are and how they find it, how they patch it, and what order to do it in, because not everything can get patched day one.
Yeah, and we had some of that too with respect to the Log4j thing, but I think the Log4j situation was a bit unique because of the way it was embedded in so many different platforms and so many different pieces of software. It wasn't something you could necessarily query for, where do we have Log4j installed? It's more of, where do we have Apache installed, or where do we have pieces of Apache installed? And when you start talking about multiple iterations and versions of various Linux operating systems, it's not as cut and dried as it is on other platforms. So we did have a little bit of a scramble in that respect. I wish it hadn't been quite so that much, but it's a case of maturity. It's as long as I keep looking at, as long as we keep getting better, that's the important piece.
How do you make, just as an engineer, how do you make time in your day to make sure that things are getting better, or in your week, rather than just putting out fires and dealing with the routine?
It's hard. I can't tell you that every day that that's the case. It might be every month, take an assessment, but you have to build time into it to do reflection. You have to build time into your program to make sure things are getting better. And as long as you have conscientious engineers and conscientious management, things do get better. One of the things that I have as part of my yearly cycle is policy refresh.
Mhm.
So do we go through, I go through and take a look at, our information security policy and our data access policies and those sorts of things. And what needs to be updated this year? Did the updates we did last year, are they still good? Do we need to tweak things? How's the verbiage? Did we get any feedback from the user base? Because our users have to read the information security policy every year, or at least attest that they read it. So, do we get feedback on this sort of thing? So it's an iterative cycle, so that's the way I tend to look at it. Every week, every month, every couple months, every quarter, every year, are we pushing the ball forward? I tend to look at information security a little bit as like we're Sisyphus. We're pushing that boulder up the hill. And as long as we keep, pushing it forward just a little bit, then we're doing our job.
Okay. So going back in time to old NRAO, before you guys were as well resourced and mature as you are now, what are the things you didn't know then, from a technical perspective, that you wish you had, that you've learned this thing, but you're like, wow, if I knew this 2 years ago, my life would have been so much better?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because we've made so many good strides in so many different ways, but I think the big one is that, having worked in the pharma industry for a large contract research organization, there was a lot of money available at times. I had a large budget for the security team, and that's not necessarily the case here. We work in federally funded academia with the bonuses and benefits of both of those things, right? So we do things, a lot more of the, instead of purchasing, a $30,000 piece of software, we have Zeek. Zeek's free. So I have personally gotten up to speed a lot better and re-honed a lot of those Linux skills that I hadn't used in 20 odd years. So now it's one of these things that, knowing now, I'm a lot better at Linux than I used to be, because I worked in the Windows and Cisco world for so long. It's from the Zeek standpoint, the monitoring you touched on earlier, we had to do some shoring up. Our main Zeek server in our main office in Charlottesville was not looking at the right side of the traffic. And when we moved it to the proper side of the traffic, it became drinking from a fire hose, a big fire hose. So we spent a lot of time and a lot of effort getting that system basically rebuilt, reconfigured, and then finally tuned. So if I had known then what I know now, we could have spent, a lot less time on that. That was a really frustrating endeavor in a lot of ways.
So I'm often an advocate of, don't try to fix it with another fancy tool or box and, work with your people. But I also realize that the fancy tools and boxes can buy you back time as a security engineer. So I'm going to ask you two questions. One, if there was an expertise that you could magically download into your organization, whether that's with a magically funded new hire or someone downloading it matrix style into your brain, what would it be? And if there was something that a gadget could take off your hands or a service, what would that thing be that you would like to push off and not have a human do?
Wow, those are good questions. I'm going to start with the second one, I think. Because they kind of dovetail together. If I could have a clone of me that could handle like the day-to-day type stuff.
The IRB won't let me clone you, I asked.
Yeah, I know. But
they said the world can only handle one.
That's true. And they broke the mold and beat the mold maker after after they made me. But no, if I had somebody that could handle the sort of day-to-day type stuff that I deal with, the help desk tickets, I can't do this, hey, I help, I'm reporting phishing, we have a very large investment and commitment to user training, and I love it. I love everything about it. We do, in the spring, I'm about to actually go through we've got a partner that we use some training videos with, and we do basically a computer-based training, campaign in the spring, and then in the fall we do what we call the security briefings, which is kind of like a State of the Union sort of thing, where we talk about the phishing examples that we've gotten and the security incidents and what the world looks like in terms of cybersecurity. So we keep our users extremely informed, and I'm a big advocate of that because technical defenses only go but so far, and you can only tune them but so far. I mean, think of your anti-spam filters and such. You tune it but so much, and if you tune it too much or too tightly, then you're blocking legitimate emails. But if you have it too loose, then spam gets through. So there's like this kind of sort of sweet spot. But even then, you still get spam coming through and phishing comes through. And technical measures are hard to defeat, but people are really soft. People are easy to defeat. So I like to keep my users extremely educated, which means that they're constantly reporting phishing. So it's kind of a two-way street there. It's like, hey, great, good job. So I spend, I don't want to say an inordinate amount of my time, but a surprising amount of my time, giving attaboys, sort of things. If I could have somebody that could handle all of that sort of stuff, so I could actually focus on policy revision, identity management, multi-factor type stuff, those sorts of things that we need to, in order to, keep our security, posture strong and that sort of thing, and keep our program mature and maturing more, and filling those musts on the CI framework. It would be great. That's what I could use. I could use another person to handle the day-to-day stuff. But that requires somebody coming in and being up to speed, and that doesn't happen around here very quickly. Mm-hmm. What was the first one again?
The first one was, what would you want to offload to a gadget, appliance, or service so that you didn't have to spend people time on it?
Yeah, so that's sort of the same sort of thing. If I could have a service that could handle the training aspects, or maybe a better, more capable of anti-spam, or I would really love a web content filter that handled, that pretty much intercepted everything regardless of whether people were at home or in the office, because you think about most of your proxies, they're location based. I would love an active web content filter, but those are extremely spendy, and I don't have the budget for that.
Okay, awesome. So we've talked a little bit about things that you'd like to offload because it's taking time from your world, and things that you could be spending on making improvements. One of the mental models I use for this a lot is the black swan events versus the gray pigeons. A black swan is really rare, but really devastating. It's unlikely, but you don't want it to ever happen to you. It could be an existential threat to your whole organization. Gray pigeons, nobody thinks a pigeon is dangerous, but if enough of them show up and poop on your work every day, you're not going to get anything done. Would you say that you're trying to focus on both preparing for black swans and eliminating gray pigeons, or have you been focused on one or the other?
They both live rent-free in my head, basically. And we do have a couple black swan scenarios. A case of somebody were to get in and then interfere with telescope monitoring and control, or something, along those lines. That's the really big, the big thing that kind of keeps me up at night. At the same time, the potential for that happening is relatively small. Mm-hmm. So like you said, it's extremely rare, and I don't focus a whole lot on it. Also, the things that we would need to do in order to re-architect basically infrastructure that's 40 plus years old and was built before things like multi-factor or even network segmentation were really ideas. There would be a tremendous lift and shift and required an inordinate amount of downtime and coordination, that it's more of a case of, that ship's not going to happen. We need to work on how can we make things better in a preventative sort of way. And so I would say I spend more of my time dealing with pigeons than anything, and washing the windows and things like that. It's more of a case of phishing, people trying to hack their way in and use compromise some sort of one of the web servers or something along those lines. And endpoint protection, that's one of the things that I've got on my my wish list and want list from the ResearchSOC is lovely endpoint protection.
We currently have a solution in testing. It will not be ready for production in the next few months, though.
Yeah, that's I know, I'm eagerly looking to be patient zero on that.
All right. So one of the things that I think a lot about in terms of NRAO in particular, when I deal with people who have InfoSec backgrounds who are coming from industry, the first thing they want to do is make everything confidential. You know, the good old CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And getting them through the idea that the vast majority of what we protect is meant to be public and not confidential, but we really, really care about integrity. We want people to trust our data so they can base science and decisions and things on this data, knowing that it's valid, knowing that it's true. But something we talk about almost as much as availability, and a lot of academia, if it's down for a day or two, you might annoy somebody, but it's better than something bad happening. You guys monitor events that are literally on an astronomical scale. If this only happens once every 20,000 years and you miss it, not only are we out of luck, the next several generations are out of luck. We're just not getting it back. So how do you deal with that need for availability combined with the need to patch regularly and all these other things?
Yeah, well, redundancy helps. Having clusters of systems and taking down one node at a time and not really having it affect anything. That's that certainly helps. But it's a very delicate balance. Thankfully, a lot of what we do in terms of observing, we won't patch in the middle of something like that. So if we've got somebody's locked out the telescope for a while and we're looking at these things. So we tend to, it's a balancing game is really the short answer. And I don't mean to be glib about it, but it is. It's a balancing act. It's how much risk can you take when it comes to patching and how much can you accept? So there's a lot of risk management and risk acceptance processes in there versus availability and having to, because the scientists are our clients. And like you said, the data is not necessarily confidential. It's, for the most part, it's something that we want to give away freely. So yeah, it was a bit of a change for me coming out of the world of pharma, where you didn't give anything away and everything was absolutely locked away.
Awesome. So from a technical standpoint, I know that you guys have a mix of bare metal and also some virtualized infrastructure. I guess, first of all, how hard is it to run that blend? I know a lot of organizations have stayed bare metal or gone full virtual because they feel that managing both is difficult. What do you think about that?
I came out of a Unix and then Windows server background. For many, many years, I was a server monkey. So, and it was right when the whole, spin from bare metal pizza boxes, racks of pizza box servers to, virtual boxes and blade servers and such started happening. And I'm a big fan of virtualization because it's real easy to duplicate a machine and spin up a second one if you need more compute or more capacity and that sort of stuff. I think it's made many people's lives much easier. And you don't necessarily have to have a big beefy box for a sole purpose. We can get a big beefy box and have a bunch of smaller boxes on it, as virtuals, and nobody really notices the difference. I find that it's also, becomes a bit easier when it's, comes to patching and that sort of thing too.
That's exactly where I was hoping to take you.
Yeah, from a virtual standpoint, I'm a big fan of that.
Mm-hmm. If you had the choice of being back in the world of pizza boxes and everything being bare metal versus the hybrid scenario you have now, do you think that it's worth it? Because I've had people tell me they're very afraid of securing a split infrastructure, but you guys do it so well. Yeah,
and I can't really speak too well to that because everywhere I've been has always had a split infrastructure in that regard. Going in, especially if you've been at a place that's been around for a few decades, you're going to have that sort of split infrastructure. And I don't ever see a situation where we won't have split infrastructure simply because of the way we have high performance compute nodes and that sort of thing. So we're going to have some of that either way. But from a lot of our day-to-day type stuff, it's real easy to do it on virtual, and I can't see any world without it.
Great. So I know you're excited about endpoint security offerings coming out. I know that I've gotten to talk with your boss, David Halstead, about the CIS control set and the path to adoption at NRAO and where you want to get to in your maturity journey. As you look forward to that, what do you think are some of the hardest challenges that you're going to have to face, especially being a science organization without some of the resources and without some of the bog standardness of your infrastructure that we often see in most of the commercial world?
Inertia is, I think, the big one. We've always done it this way. We've always done it this way. Think about how many times you hear that, you know, well, yeah, that's good and all, but we've always done it this way. Well, let's rethink. So especially when you've got an organization, you know, like ours, it's, you know, been here for 50 years. We were on the internet before there was an internet. So it's, you know, there's a lot of inertia, a lot of code that was written, you know, decades and decades ago. So we've got a lot of our history, which is wonderful, is also sort of our enemy in this regard, because cybersecurity is always forward thinking and it's not necessarily so backwards thinking. And we've got a lot of things that don't really wrap themselves around to, you know, current security trends. Now, the nice thing about it is that using the, you know, trusted CIS framework, we can look forward and architect new things with this in mind, you know, using the Purdue model and zero trust and things along those lines, MFA, all the lovely things that we like to think about when we think of modern cybersecurity. But a lot of our historical inertia is, I think, our biggest challenge here. And to that, we've got a lot of people that work here that have been here for a long time. And if you think about in the early mid-90s when, you know, the internet first started, you know, burgeoning, it was collegial. You know, why would anybody want to, you know, crack into somebody else's server and, you know, do bad things? It's just why would you do that? So there's a lot of that sort of, you know, mindset, you know, around here that's been here for a while. Some people just don't understand why you would want to have to lock somebody out. You know, the idea of, you know, least privilege, you know, well, you know, just because I've got admin access, you know, everybody should have admin access because ... I might need it someday. Well, not really. You only need to have what you need to have. And there's no reason that just because you've got admin access means you need to have root to, you know, access to the finance shares or what have you. So there's a lot of that sort of thing. But I love the, you know, the CIS controls, that framework. It's perfect for us because it's not weighty like the NIST or, you know, any of, you know, the NIST standards and such are. It's easy to get bogged down, you know, in one of those frameworks, whereas the CIS control set is small enough and nimble enough, yet firm enough that it can, you know, guide us where we need to be.
Okay. Before I jump into my next question, I wanted to remind the audience that we'd love to answer your questions. So just drop them into chat and we'll make sure that we're actually talking about things you want to hear about. In the meantime, something I wanted to ask you about actually was legacy software. You know, we have this deep dive on Log4Shell coming up after this session. And one of the things that we touch on there is that seeing legacy software as safe because nobody's announcing security vulnerabilities is something we've run into a lot in academia. You know, oh, we haven't had a vulnerability report on this in 40 years. Does anyone outside your physics center use that piece of software? Those sorts of things. How do you deal with legacy software and how do you communicate the risks so that you're actually either getting something maintained or practicing enough defense in depth that hopefully you won't be paying the price?
Yeah, that's hard. That's a hard one. We've got a ton of technical debt. We've got a lot of legacy software. We've got a lot of abandonware where someone wrote something, they stood it up, it worked great on Red Hat 5, and they tried to upgrade it to Red Hat 6, and it borked, and they just kind of walked away from it, and it's running, nobody touch it, don't even look at it, please don't do anything. And now we've got a situation where, okay, yeah, great, that's now, you know, a decade out of support, a decade out of compliance, there are no patches coming from it, and it's vulnerable to all kinds of things. So how do we deal with that? Well, it's painful. It requires, sysadmins to, to actually have to force the issue. Thankfully, again, we've got management that understands this and, has my back when we say, look, we've got Red Hat 6 boxes that need to be upgraded. They need to be upgraded or they need to be pulled off the network. And that's just the end of the story. The log4shell, log4j thing, I thought could possibly be one of those, those big levers, that this is the one where, okay, you're running these services on unsupported OS, unsupported software. Sorry, that day is now. So sometimes you have to play hard, and I don't like it because I'd much rather be friendly about it. But at the same time, if you've got, a piece of software that was written by somebody 14 years ago and they've not been with the company in 7 years, but it's a vital piece of software, something has to give somewhere. And just because there's not vulnerability announcements for them is not necessarily a good thing. Usually it means that it's, they've stopped supporting it and you're not going to hear anything. And no news is not good news in this case.
So one of the things you mentioned earlier is because of the budgets that we have working in this federally sponsored science space, you rely on a lot of free tools. Can you talk about some of the ones that you just would not want to live without?
Yeah, Zeek being one. That's the biggest one that I've found here. We do have a couple paid for tools that I've used in a past life that I really like. But Zeek being the biggest one there in terms of free tools.
Okay, awesome. So another question that's come up to me a lot is we see a lot of sort of new entrants to cybersecurity as a field who are having better time, in analyst roles or in communications roles or places where they're not getting to do hard tech early in their career. What is your advice for people who either are trying to break into those junior level engineering positions or are trying to make room in their organization so that they can benefit from that less expensive junior talent, even if they're a small organization and it's hard to provide sort of the infrastructure stability and mentoring that those youngsters need?
So I'd say it's twofold. One is, and they kind of go together. One is find something that you enjoy and that you're good at. Cybersecurity is such a vast, broad, field. There's people who love firewalls. There's people who love intrusion detection, intrusion prevention. There's people who love user education. And, my background is actually in sociology and religious studies and education. So, I came into the technical side of things, purely as I like to build computers and I got a help desk job and that, as one works their way up, and then eventually I specialized in security because I was the guy that handled the antivirus system for a long time. So find something that you enjoy and something that you're good at. And those two things can, go hand in hand. And then find a way to take that and make that a value add to your organization. So, hey boss, I found this, it does this, it's lifted a whole load off of us doing this. And this is freeing me up to do these other things. And, so if you can find a way to get what you're doing to be a value add to the, to the organization, that puts you in good light, and management's going to like that.
Mm-hmm. What about from the organizational standpoint? I know that we're always struggling with turnover and cybersecurity budgets. What do you think are some things that could make, you talked about the person who could do the day-to-day for you so that you were focused on the big picture. What do you think the challenges are with actually supporting those more junior engineers in small cybersecurity organizations like we have?
That's hard because the allure of the dollar is always, going to be the big elephant in the room. It's, I can go over here and make, 20 grand more if I go do this or, that sort of thing. There's that combined with the fact that people tend to get bored easily. I don't know about you, but most engineers I know have true ADD when it comes to, I'm doing this and then boom, shiny, I'm now focused on this.
We actually call it shiny disorder in my office.
Oh, there you have it. So that's perfect. And so getting, junior engineers to want to focus, and I don't want to say specialize in something, because you need to specialize early on, you need to specialize in nothing, be a sponge, absorb it all. But eventually you'll find something that you want and you like. But to getting someone to focus and actually see a commitment through, see a project through, is tremendously difficult. I can't tell you how many times we've started something and gotten a third of the way in, and it's just like, okay, we're good enough. It's the joke of mediocrities. Meh, good enough. And so the tendency to do that is high, especially with a junior engineering sort of thing. It's like, okay, we get it, and we get it good enough. And it's even harder here, I think, in like you said, the federally funded science academia space, because there's so much that we have to do, and so little time to do it all, and so the staffing constraints are tremendous. We don't have the budget for as many people as we would love to have. And so it's a matter of how much can we do, how quickly can we do it. And I don't want to say how good enough can we do it, because I strive for excellence. That's what we want is, we want everything to be perfect. At the same time, you don't want perfect to be the enemy of being done, sort of thing. So, or even getting started from that standpoint. So we've got a lot of initiatives that we looked at. Well, if we can't do it right, maybe we shouldn't do it right now. So prioritization and that risk matrix comes in. What are your biggest risks? How are we going to fix these top things? Look for the low hanging fruit. What can you get the biggest bang for the buck from? And that helps with the junior engineering side of things too, because give them something that they can find progress in and find success in. So you want to encourage that, build them up so that they can feel successful about things. It's a lot. I have teenagers. It's a lot like the same.
Yeah, I have a teen too at this point. There's quite a few of us with him banging around. He's just getting to the point where he no longer wants to be paid in pizza and ice cream, though.
Yep.
So we probably only have time for one or two more questions. If I get to pick a favorite, it's going to be, one of the upsides, I think, of working in cybersecurity in the scientific cyber infrastructure space is where a lot of people are staring at, the same server rack they have, regardless of what industry they're in. We get to try to secure a lot of cool things. I really care about the ICS and SCADA systems because they are crucial to what we do. But it's also cool to get to secure a giant telescope. It's cool to be able to work with these tremendous and growing data stores. And if we can keep the Bitcoin miners off of them, it's cool to have a lot of supercomputing around. What do you think are the things that people take for granted when moving from that sort of, I'm going to secure the mail server and the web server world to our far more varied world? What are some things that they would benefit from knowing about earlier in that journey?
Well, from looking at it from our standpoint, the telescope monitoring and the securing telescopes is very much that ICS, that ICS SCADA model, because that's basically what they are. You just on a different sort of scale or a different factor. So there's that. But for me, the best part about cybersecurity is that we're never bored. There's always something happening. There's never a dull day. And if you are having a slow day, go read your SANS Internet Storm Center or something along those lines. Go check out Ars Technica, and then you can proceed to not sleep for another 3 days because because there's always some sort of emerging threat out there. Looking at this, this whole, Russia-Ukraine situation, I wonder what sort of emerging cyber threats are going to come out of that. I suspect we're going to see some new nation state activity as a result of that. And, being in this federal academia space, we're the ones they like to poke at.
Absolutely. I think that brings me to what will be my last question, which is, we see attackers at completely different levels of sophistication, and everybody does, right? There's from the, this was automated 50 years ago, and the person who, not 50 years ago, but 20 years ago, and the person who wrote the exploit's probably dead, but because people keep, opening worms, it still exists. To, the bored teenager, to the hacktivist, to the more organized cybercrime, to the state level actors, to the sort of 1 in a million APTs that we hopefully don't see too often. In that scale, how do you think about that? Do you try to protect against everything? Do you say, okay, we're going to get up past bored teenager level and then we're going to reassess? Or how do you approach that?
Oh, that's hard. Yeah, a lot of the sort of things you see are obviously the automated stuff, the botnets and that sort of thing that's just beating against you, trying scripts, trying dictionary attacks. That's most of what we see. The advanced stuff is more in the phishing, the soft, what I consider, the soft hacking, phishing, voice phishing, vishing, SMS text phishing type stuff. Those are the ones that I see with respect to our user base actually having success. That's because machines are hard to break. Passphrases, if you got it, 12, 15 characters in that passphrase, it's virtually uncrackable. But if you can trick, grandma into divulging her social security number, now you've got or going to Target and paying her IRS bill with gift cards, that she doesn't have, then that sort of thing, that's the sort of thing that I tend to focus the most on, because our users are our customers, and they're also our weakest link. So if we can keep them educated, keep them on top of things, then it makes our job having to clean up after things a whole lot easier.
Absolutely. I lied about that being the last question. We have a minute left and we have one audience question. So we're going to try to make it work. Have you documented the things you build up, which could be provided for other campus and research networks with similar problems? A way to learn from the things you said, from Daniel Weber.
Yeah, the answer is sort of, I think we all fall into the same trap that it's do, and afterwards the QMint part of the do, doesn't happen. So, it documents, as we get focused on the do part of it. So it's, some of it gets documented. We try to keep a little bit of that sort of stuff around, or a lot, but I'd like to have a lot more. And if I had that, that clone of me, that person would also be dealing with documentation. So unfortunately, the answer is not necessarily, certainly not to the point where it's beyond anything of, bullet points, this is what we did, or don't do this and that sort of stuff. I wish we were better at documentation. And that's, I hate to say it, that's a personal failing of mine. I document as I go, but I rarely turn those scribble notes into anything that's formalized.
I will say that this is a place that Trusted CI is great to have in the community. For example, they're doing an annual challenge right now where they're looking at the lessons learned of several different facilities in how they manage ICS and SCADA systems and providing guidance for the whole community. And they've done a lot of similar efforts of just taking the knowledge that exists somewhere and making it available to everyone. So
I'm a big fan of Trusted CI.
And with that, I think we've wrapped up. So everyone, thank you for joining us. In about 10 minutes or so, we're going to be doing a Log4Shell deep dive, and we hope to see you there.
Okay, first of all, what is Log4j and Log4Shell? Log4j, or Log4j, as I'm told it's pronounced sometimes, though I've heard it used both ways, is a library for Java that allows you to log information, but it allows you to do a lot more than that, and that was part of the issue. Log4Shell is the informal name for that particular vulnerability, which I have the CVE number in this presentation here in a bit. But it's meant for logging in Java, but it's also capable of lookups using JNDI, Java Naming and Directory Interface. And JNDI provides naming and directory functionality, but it also allows the ability to pull Java serialized objects from other places. So you can actually pull code from other places. One of its core design features, my understanding, is you could configure in one place, let's say on an LDAP server, the configurations you want, and everybody can go look at that and change the configurations as needed. But it also allows for a lot of other things. Many developers just thought of it as input, like just always straight text, nothing that would ever be executed, just something that would go in a log, but it was something more than that. Okay, there was a remote code execution vulnerability, as well as some exfil issues with this particular vulnerability. It's CVE 2021-44228. You want to look it up? I have links off to all this information later on, and there'll be a QR code a little bit later on if you want to view this presentation as the slides. It impacted a whole bunch of different versions of Apache Log4j. The affected software is any version of Log4j less than 2.15, and it was announced late on a Friday, and I'll emphasize that a little bit more later on December 10th, 2021. Now, there's a little bit of history behind this vulnerability because it's actually existed for a long time before anybody actually bothered to really dive deep into it and find it and use it. The earliest stuff involving JNDI lookups and Log4j, it was a feature that was implemented on like July 17th, 2013. So this vulnerability has existed since then. It's just no one really thought about it until more recently. It was inadvertently found though by someone back in 2014. Someone wanted to be able to disable JDNI lookups, and it misinterpreted data they meant to send as just a straight string as something to actually be executed. Well, they didn't want that, so they wanted a feature to be able to turn off lookups as necessary so that that doesn't happen. There was a presentation given at Black Hat 2016, a few years later, that actually went into using JNDI and LDAP to be able to do remote code execution. They weren't talking about Log4j or Log4j at all. There's other places where you can slip in some JNDI and get execution, and other applications don't even involve Log4j. And they have a presentation out there if you want to watch it later, which is pretty informative exactly how it worked. But people have been thinking about this kind of vulnerability since 2016. It just didn't get a whole lot of awareness, I suppose. Now, this particular CVE was actually, or what became the CVE, was originally reported to Apache from an Alibaba employee, Chen Sujun, I may be mispronouncing that, on November 24th of 2021. They also announced it in a tweet on December 9th before the official CVE came out. On December 1st, Cloudflare started to detect the attacks. So apparently it was circling around probably amongst probably some more nefarious people, but probably just also among researchers. Around December 1st is when Cloudflare first saw it. And then it was announced on Friday, December 10th, 2021. Being late on a Friday also caused part of the consternation on it, because people were like, okay, what do I need to patch? I need to do it now. It's the weekend, which caused extra problems for some people. I remember checking the Red Hat errata list, and it didn't have anything in the morning, but this popped up later in the day. So it's, if you're looking at vulnerability announcement lists, it's best to check at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day to be sure. Okay, here's how Log4Shell works. Any configuration which allows a remote connection to supply arbitrary data that is written to log files by an application using Log4j library is acceptable to exploitation. Essentially, I'm gonna go back to something I said earlier. Remember how I said in 2014, someone inadvertently found this flaw because they were doing something that Java interpreted or Log4j interpreted as a command to do a lookup when all they want to do is log data. I had a similar experience this way back in the late 90s when I was writing an application to randomly choose what restaurant to go to. And I found whenever someone tried to submit, oh, Charlie is just a possible thing in the list, it broke my code, because late 90s SQL injection, I was copying and pasting code for VB from someone else's application. This is a similar sort of thing where you have, if someone can control what data is fed in, they can possibly manipulate things and get code execution or exfiltration of data. Now, depending on what code is present on the server, they could leverage this to execute a payload. The way this payload normally works is something you'd serve up, but I've also heard of people who have restricted to where nothing outside of their particular environment can be accessed. So you couldn't like throw in an arbitrary piece of code, but there might be code already existing on systems that could lead to code execution. And this could be done, this Log4j attack can be done in pretty much any way you can get something into Log4j. So if you're using Log4Shell, this would be something like form strings, that's a common one, user agents, and a whole lot of other things. If it's some kind of string that might get interpreted as a JNDI lookup, it's quite possible that it could be vulnerable. And here's like an example down here at the bottom. A JDNI lookup uses LDAP, goes to the bad guy's server on whatever port, and let's say includes a piece of Java code into the application. With this, you can do all sorts of things like getting a shell back, or with some more work getting a Meterpreter session on there. Meterpreter, by the way, is a shell made for Metasploit, an exploitation of framework, and allows you a lot more features. But for the demo I'm going to give eventually here, I'm just going to go with a simple shell. Okay, here is a simple illustration of how the attack works in general. And I have to move my Zoom window around so I can actually see my own illustration. So we have the hacker frog here, and what they'll do is they'll send this little JNDI lookup as part of a string. If that string gets logged by Log4j, by the server, it'll go to, it'll run through Log4j, it'll look at that particular LDAP lookup, and you can have it go reach out to an attacker server, grab code, and execute it on the server that you're trying to compromise. Is there any questions so far?
I'll throw one in there.
Okay.
Is LDAP the only protocol that this can happen over?
No, there's also Cobra, and I think the other protocol is called RMI.
Am I wrong, or was there a DNS example at some point?
There's also a DNS example.
Okay.
I've got a demo app that in theory you should be able to exfil DNS traffic, but it kind of, DNS information, looking at text records and so forth. But unfortunately, it's not actually working on the demo box right now because I don't think I have the correct version of Java to make it fully functioning.
Okay.
But yes, there is more than you can do just execute. There's also some exfil things with DNS that can be done.
Okay, thanks. Continue.
Here's an illustration from someone else, govcert.ch, showing the basic vulnerability. Someone makes a request that has some content in it that's going to be logged. It may be that JNDI command or a DNS query of some kind, as long as it's doing some kind of lookup. And the remote server will try to log that. And in the process of logging it, Log4j can reach out to a malicious LDAP server, or possibly a non-malicious one, but just happens to have code that you don't want to be executed, and pull that down and execute it in the context of wherever Log4j is working. Now, there's several ways people can stop this from happening. There's different rules you can put in on a web application firewall, or WAF. You can disable remote code bases, can help. Though if it's not remote, it might still be able to be used, though that's going to be a much more difficult attack. You can disable Log4j, and also, of course, patching is the most sensible thing to do. And you can also disable JNDI lookups. Now, I have an app from CyberXML that allows you to give a quick demo of how exactly the Log4j shell works. And I hear all the basic commands, but I'm going to go to a terminal here in a second and just issue the commands individually. Obviously, don't run this on anything production. Don't run it on a public network. Run it at home, play with it. By the way, if you see text in red in here, that is why we placed the IP address in the configs with my own IP address of my host VM, which is hosting the Docker images. But let's start off with what we need to do to actually get this up and running. I've opened up 3 different shells, and this one I don't actually want running because it's from a previous test. It'll end here shortly. Okay, let's look through the steps we have to do to actually get this installed. This URL, and I have all this linked in the presentation for people to download later and look at. To actually get it, hopefully everybody, I'm not sure how much maintenance you'll do or how many scripts you use, but if you want to get that repository, just git clone and that repository. And I've already have it there, so I get an error message, but it takes a few minutes to download. It doesn't take too awful long. Now, if I wanted to change directory, proof of concept, change it to that. And the next step to actually be able to use this would be to edit my Docker Compose YML file. And as you'll see in here, in a couple of places, I had to edit things. Specifically, this listener address port had to be changed to the IP address of whatever the host VM was. And that should be the only one you have to change. Just do a quick if config to find your IP address. Okay, once we have that edited, we can go ahead and build it. Now, that's not going to take long here at all because it's already built. So you build it, and now it's basically just using the examples. So it's not too often difficult. First thing we'll do is we'll start a netcat listener. So netcat listener, a little bit verbose. Let's see. I think that's what it was. It's going to listen for a shell to be shoveled back to me. Shell shoveling is basically when you get another remote box to send you back a shell that you can interact with. Now, the interaction with this particular netcat shell is not that great, but it's good enough for illustrating the purposes. So I'm going to start up a listener. That's listening. And now I'm going to go into one of the other terminals and fire this up. So notice it doesn't say anything about anybody connecting. It just says it's listening as of right now. So Docker Compose up inside of the Log4j proof of concept folder, and that should be going. Now, I still don't have anything yet. I have to actually get some kind of payload into there. So let me go to the website that serves up. And it's a super simple web application. It's just enough bare bones to give you an idea. Admin and password is a password for the default on this little application. But let's say instead of using the username there and using the actual username, I use an attack string. In this case, the attack string I want to use is this JNDI command that tells it to use LDAP and go out and fetch this particular bit of information, which is some code to be executed. So I'll put that into the username field. And actually, I'm going to switch panes here so you can actually see the connection as it's being made. Now, when I hit login, that should automatically give me back a shell. It connected on, it says I got a connection, but I don't see a whole lot of stuff as of yet. So I can interact with it. I don't have command completion, I don't have command history, but I can issue commands like ls etc. If I want to, who am I? Oh, helps if you actually spell it right. User, environmental stuff, execute whatever you want. This is probably a fairly low privileged account, but as you can see, I got a shell from it, and there might be some data I can get from that. I can look around for files, see if I can find anything that might be something they don't want me to necessarily see. Now, that's one example of using this and exploiting a problem with Log4j and using log4shell to, well, get yourself a shell. But there are other ways of doing it. You don't have to do just a form field attack. This is the one I just showed. By the way, as I said before, everything you see in red is where you replace it with your IP address that you're hosting everything from. If you wanted to play around and test, and again, don't test in any kind of environment where someone hostile might be trying to scan for potentially vulnerable applications. But some of the steps are, well, most of the steps are exactly the same. So I'm gonna go back to here. I'm gonna kill my listener. I'm going to kill that Docker instance, just to start fresh. And let me fire up that netcat listener again. Let me fire up my little Docker instance with the vulnerable web application. And by the way, it doesn't have to be a web application. If it gets logged by Log4j, it's potentially vulnerable if it doesn't have other mitigations in place or it hasn't been properly patched. Okay, everything is listening. So instead, let's try a user agent attack string. The user agent attack string, basically, when an HTTP request is made, it sends various headers along with it. And one of those is the user agent string. Well, if you make the user agent string be the attack string, that's JNDI, that's a lookup for JD&I lookup, you can potentially do bad things. So let's give that a shot. I'm going to be using a curl command here, and I'll explain the entire curl command once I get it on the command line. Sorry for all the copy and pasting, but this is far better than me fat fingering every couple of minutes. So quick explanation of this command. I curl a -V for verbose, uppercase A for user agent string, and I'm going to set my user agent string to this. And what this is going to do is from this particular hostile LDAP server, it's going to request a bit of code and it's going to actually execute it. And this is just basically telling it where to fetch this from. So I use verbose so you actually see this part. But as you see, it set my user agent string to this. And a user agent string is something that's fairly commonly logged. So that's probably a good attack angle to go for. So let's go back here. It says we have a connection. And again, we can do LS, we can look around, we can do pretty much anything we want to with a very simplistic shell. Now from here, we can work a little harder and try to get something like interpreter on there, which is a much more powerful shell. But you see the general concept of how the exploit works. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Chat seems to be quiet. Folks, don't hesitate to throw questions in the chat box. We'd love to address any issues that you have or just help explain an angle of this that you may not have seen before.
But that's two ways of attack. There's other things that can be done. Like I said, anything that Forge logs and it is able to do a lookup, it's potentially a problem. So what mitigations are available for this? Well, of course, there's patching, make sure everything's patched to the newest version, but you can also turn off lookups. And this is often set via Java ops. And also you can go in and if you're not using that particular package and you're not upgrading, you can actually remove that class from your jar files to solve the problem. One of the problems with patching this all in one place is oh, sorry, I got distracted because someone I thought someone sent a message. I heard it pop up. One problem with patching this is a lot of people roll their own classes and include it with the rest of the package. So it's hard to patch all in one place. And every application is a little bit different. How it's going to get something logged, where it's going to get logged is different. So it's not as easy as one single package you have to upgrade, because then people use this library in different ways and may be pulling code from different locations. If you want to check your logs for attack attempts, there's a simple grep command you can use to look around. And this one not only looks for LDAP, but we mentioned before, RMI is another protocol that could be used for similar attacks. And that talk from Black Hat 2016 covers some of that. And DNS is another possibility. And apparently also Cobra, though I haven't seen much work being done on that so far. Would you look for your log files for that? Or if you're using some kind of security event manager, you can look around for certain strings. Like for instance, in Splunk, you could use a search like this bottom one to find LDAP, RMI, and DNS requests that are trying to be used in lookups and look into that for possibly malicious behavior. So what went wrong? Now this is going to be a matter of opinion. I think Susan's going to cover this far more than I am, but some people have stated this lookup feature probably should have been opt-in for power users by default. By default off, I mean, as in you have to be a power user, you want to turn it on and know to turn it on. Because a lot of people only thought of Log4j as logging strings. They didn't think of it as something that could actually be used to execute or do some kind of extra querying for information. So since people didn't know it had that functionality, people didn't look into it. Like I said, this particular vulnerability technically has been in existence since 2013. Someone found it in 2014 inadvertently, and they were talking about it in 2016, but it didn't actually get wide attention till 2021. So education of developers on exactly how these libraries work would be important, because if they knew that this could possibly lead to execution, they may not necessarily use that or disable lookups on their particular implementation. There's also other odd injection vectors people should probably look into it. Like I said, those people who've been looking into this since, well, as far as research, as far as I know, 2016, probably before then. But there's also some odd injection vectors that I think people probably need to look into more. One of the ones I'm fascinated by is the idea of barcodes being used as injection vectors. But anytime a user controls the data and that data has something to do with execution, there is a potential for a problem. And besides J and DI, there's also remote method invocation and COBRA that could possibly be used, Common Object Request Broker Architecture. And that Black Hat 2016 talk goes into that somewhat, though they mostly focus on LDAP. And one of the statements, I'm not sure how I should best phrase this, usable exploits are temporary, sort of, because eventually someone's going to hopefully patch it. Hopefully, that's why I say sort of. But generally speaking, one-off exploits go away as people patch, but design config mistakes last forever because user-controlled input and finding code execution has gone around for a long time. You have your format strings, you have your SQL injection, and now you have these LDAP lookups. And there's tons of other ones that could potentially cause problems in the future. So it's something people probably need to think more about as they're designing things. Also, another principle is use code with the least functionality that you actually need for what you need to do. For instance, if they use different login code that didn't have this functionality, that might be improvement. A common statement is the simpler it is, the more secure it is. Probably a generally true axiom. And if anybody wants more information on Log4j and the Log4Shell vulnerability, I have a QR code up here that you can scan, and it will take you to these slides, which I will be going in to correct a couple things here in a few minutes. But there's a few good write-ups. There's, of course, the CVE entry itself you can take a look at. And a few people have done analysis on it. And there's some good write-ups out there. I believe Josh recommended Royce Williams is one to me, and that's good write-up. And you can find out more information about Log4j and the Log4Shell vulnerability. Is there any questions? Is there any part you want me to go back and review?
I love that the first question we got is, should we trust your QR code?
That's what it should have been. That's one of the reasons I used the QR code. That one is trustworthy. It's awfully complex because the URL is for this particular Google Slides doc is kind of long. But yeah, I assure you I have not put anything bad in there. I do have something on my personal website that has plenty of bad QR codes, but this one should be safe.
We try not to attack our friends for fun and profit. Any more questions before we move to a very brief break so that we can switch presenters? All right, in that case, Adrian, I think you're off the hook. If you don't mind giving up the share, I'll take over.
Okay.
Everyone else, it is currently 1:30 p.m. Eastern time or half past the hour wherever you are. We will see you in 10 minutes at 20 till. Welcome back, everyone. It's time to get started again. So Adrian did a sort of anatomical deep dive of what Log4j meant for all of us from a technical perspective. He talked about the risks involved. He talked about the mechanism by which this vulnerability can be exploited. He talked about the different protocols affected. And we've all hopefully gotten to the end of the line as far as having to cope with the Log4Shell exploit to Log4j itself. But what now? I've heard a lot of people say that this is a one-off, it won't happen again. And I don't think that's true. I think we've learned some things from this vulnerability that we should be taking forward to help protect our organizations in the future. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So we have questions. Did this have to happen? Is it going to happen again? Can my organization do anything about it? I've got an answer for you. Yes, on all counts. I do believe that this was inevitable given the state of our software ecosystem, and it will happen again. But I don't want you to feel like this is another doom and gloom. We're going to spread some fear, uncertainty, and doubt kind of InfoSec conversation. That's not what we do at ResearchSOC. What I do want to talk about is what those root causes were, what mitigations can be taken from the world of software development and also from those operating that software and our infrastructure. And a little bit at the end, I want to spend some time on the stretch goal. How do we become part of the solution? Because this is a situation in our software ecosystem that is going to affect us for a very long time if the status quo persists. So talking not just about Log4Shell specifically, but this entire class of incidents, which I'm going to describe as incidents that are related to a non-obvious software vulnerability in something that is largely propagated through our systems as a dependency rather than I got really excited and I went out and got myself a copy of Log4j. Typically, I received Log4j as a dependency of something else I was installing, which means I may be less aware of it. And also incidents where the time and effort taken to remediate a specific critical vulnerability is so significant that it can take away from other cybersecurity software or ops efforts. So what the heck is the root cause of all this? The first one is growing software complexity, and I'm going to spend some time after this slide talking about the difference between something that is complicated and something that is complex. Software and infrastructure that's too often built without remediation in mind, but we're not practicing zero defect coding. I love zero defect coding. I have a passion for zero defect coding. It's a set of methods that can reduce your instances of bugs, let alone security vulnerabilities, to very nearly zero. It is also incredibly expensive and difficult to implement. This is not something I'm going to spend a lot of time on in this particular presentation, because here I'm talking to open science facilities and higher ed. And I know that zero defect coding is one of those things that is just so high resource, it's not going to become an option for most of us. So I'm really going to focus more on what would it look like if our software and infrastructure were built with remediation in mind. Finally, there's a disconnect between the criticality of software, its quality, and the resources and incentives that flow to the developers. We're going to talk about open source software neglect. We're going to talk about perverse incentives with your software vendors, and some of the other reasons that production software may not be getting production quality architecture, maintenance, and support throughout its life cycle. As I stated before, I love questions. I love being interrupted. Feel free to come off mute and ask me a question, or feel free to type your questions into the chat and Adrian will relay them. But I really want to hear what you guys want to learn more about these types of vulnerabilities. So a program is complicated. When I say complicated, this has a specific meaning in systems thinking. What I mean is that any software program has a lot of moving parts to keep track of. There are a lot of things that impact how that program is going to react, depending on what input you give it. There can be assumptions made by the programming language about when a new thread should be spawned and when it should continue on using the thread it's got and halt other work to do a particular computation. There is differences in the algorithms that are used by the programmer. There are a lot of these little factors. There's just a question of, did I type the keyword correctly? Is this a type-safe language or is it not a type-safe language? How did I separate it into parts? Did I create a race condition? These are all things that are complicated because there's a lot to learn and a lot to keep track of, but it's wholly deterministic. When I write a computer program, I know from start to finish what the expected behaviors are and what constitutes a defect. Also, if I'm willing to spend enough time, money, expertise, and effort, I can get to a point where all of those defects have been eliminated, and I have a program that perfectly does what it was specified to do. The problem is that while one program may be complicated, software is complex. When we talk about complexity, we talk about things that take on a life of their own. This is an aerial snapshot of a neighborhood in Tokyo. For those of you who don't know, Japan is a lot less into zoning restrictions than the United States is. So you'll see multi-story apartment buildings next to single family homes, next to small business, next to a family home that's been converted to a small business, or somebody's garage where they decided to open a coffee shop. This is what we call an emergent system. Nobody planned it. There wasn't one, sketch of where the apartment building should go and why we should have a sports area over here and why we should have an elementary school over there. The neighborhood grew up from the things that the people in the neighborhood did. So whether we're talking about philosophy, systems theory, science, or art, emergence is when an entity, be it a neighborhood in Tokyo or a software ecosystem or the software in a particular facility, the entity is observed to have properties which its parts do not have on their own, properties or behavior which emerge only when these parts interact in the wider whole. For example, whether Log4Shell impacts you has a lot more to do with your network configuration, your monitoring, the dependency choices made by the developers of things that you later installed, and so on, than it does any single choice you've made to have Log4j on your systems. This was brought in as part of an ecosystem. It's an emergent property when we see bugs happen. These are not things anyone planned for. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, I really want to write bad software. What happens is a lot of different things from a lot of different programmers start interacting, often in environments those programmers didn't plan for. This is the difference between things that are complex and things that are merely complicated. This is going to be a concept you'll see woven throughout this talk, because a lot of the admonitions about ensuring that bad things don't happen to your network are based on the assumption of something that is complicated, not complex. And I will argue that most of us work in environments where our networks and everything on them and everything that touches them forms an ecosystem that is complex, not merely complicated. The next thing, and again, this is going back to those root causes, there will be bugs. So why are bugs still news? Why do they get logos? Why do we get excited and disrupt our lives for them? This is because a lot of our infrastructure is planned as if there won't be bugs, let alone security flaws. Software inventories, when they exist, tend to be shallow. For example, I know that some of my customers are running Core Light boxes. I don't think most of the customers could list the software on the Core Light boxes. I know that several of my customers are running Zeek. Most of them couldn't recite Zeek's dependency tree for me. When we talk about these different things, part of the difficulty in patching is that many of the worst problems tend to crop up deep in the stack, in dependencies of dependencies. These are things we don't usually look at or even know we have sometimes. And that's part of the reason that the things that are the scariest bugs from a remediation standpoint are often somewhere in the stack that isn't sexy, that doesn't get a lot of attention. And it's one of the reasons that our software ecosystem has so many emergent properties, things that were not planned for or organized, because there's a lot of things that we're unaware of that we're bringing in when we bring in a software package. The final factor is what I call software neglect. Resources tend to flow to the best known open source software projects and the most profitable vendors, not to your whole stack. That's a big deal. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, you know what, I'm really going to make a logging utility better today. It'll be great for my career. Okay, I know some people who've done that, but I'm a system software geek. There really aren't enough of us. What happens is when a young person says, I'm going to learn to work on software, they tend to go and work on the chat platform that they and their friends use, or a video game library, or maybe they're really into web programming and they work on a CMS, but they may not be working on the base libraries that end up being included in that CMS or on the programming language it's written in. Programming languages get a little more attention because, again, they're well known. Even if you don't know what Log4j was, you knew what Java was before Log4j was ever announced. This happens a great deal. On the other side, profitable vendors certainly have plenty of resources flowing to them. Smaller vendors don't always. Unfortunately, the ability to write software well and the ability to turn a profit don't appear that often in the same human beings. So in some cases, we've lucked out. Someone's good at both, or they've managed to recruit people from both sides of that fence. And in other cases, we see vendors who are making really important software, but come to the point where they're accepting huge amounts of technical debt, or they're not spending resources on testing because they're trying to spin out the features that they need to keep their clients happy as fast as they can. And they're afraid to invest in those big picture, important, but hard to put on a marketing brochure things. Finally, NSF, as I'm not sure if this is a real policy or sort of a tendency or something that's been passed around, but what I've been told many times is NSF will fund you to develop software, but not to maintain it. This means that many things that are focused on our community, that are focused on science, become abandonware within a few years of our adopting them. Because when there's no more new development to argue for, when it's a question of maintaining and improving something incrementally over time, it's very hard for people to get funding for that. And so they're not able to spend time on it. When software becomes neglected, there's no warning, there's no klaxon that goes off. It's something that just happens. It's usually a slow drift. Also, even the best resource software has occasional bugs. There's no amount of money that makes you bug proof. So you knew most of that. I don't think that I'm telling anyone wild and exciting news. So you may wonder, why the heck am I here? Understanding the root causes of these types of existing vulnerabilities give us a roadmap to improve things for ourselves and our organizations in the future. I'm going to spend most of this time talking about mitigations that happen when you develop software, or should, mitigations that operations teams can put in place, and the stretch goal of how do you become part of the solution for our wider ecosystem. I'm also going to introduce you to a set of mental models that helped me over the years change how I think about these types of vulnerabilities and come at them in a more effective way. I love working on software. I want to make software better. I also don't want to live in the fantasy that my software is always going to be as big as I'd wish it to be, even when I wrote it. So these mitigations are aimed at strategies related to the root causes I just went over with you. It's about taming complex systems. How can we simplify? How can we take something that's complex and make it merely complicated? When can we do that and when can't we? Assume there will be problems. Complex systems can be amazing, but they can also be messy. We need to instrument for fast remediation and defense in depth. We need to know that there are going to be failures within a complex system. And instead of trying to make that system pristine and perfect and without failures, what we need to do is be resilient against that failure. Resilience was sort of the word of the year, I want to say 3 years ago. This was pre-COVID. And every tech conference I went to was talking about resilience. And then somehow, I think in the distraction from the rest of our lives, I started hearing more about prevention and more about trying to transfer risk to other organizations and less about resilience. And I want to make that our byword again. How do we prepare for inevitable security vulnerabilities? Understand your gray pigeons. I'm going to explain gray pigeons and black swans in a little bit here. And don't let them become black swans. One of the things that I have seen go wrong is organizations accept the risk on a small problem. And they think that the risk of that small problem will not change. But what happens over time is another related small problem is accepted, and another one. And together we have the opposite of defense in depth. We have something I call stacked vulnerabilities. Sometimes these things interact in a complex system and become a bigger problem than they were before. I want to talk about how we can better understand both our vendor and open source software supply chains. And I want to talk about defense in depth as it applies both to our systems and to our software. Can we do anything about the state of the software we source from others? Of course, all of these practices are about that, both dealing with the failures of the software that we source and finding ways to make it better. So I'm not going to do a whole lot of slide flipping in this middle part of the talk, because what I want to do is I want to talk first about this list of mitigations that can happen during software development. We'll do the ops list next. Each of these lists is like 7 plus or minus 2 items. I'm not giving you a big to-do list. I know you already have a lot on your plates, and some of these should be things you are already doing. One of the reasons that I brought up things that are already common practice together with things that I'd like our community to start doing more often is because even when we're doing some of these things, I often find that our technical leadership have a disconnect in communicating to non-technical leadership above them why all of these things are valuable and how they're related to something that that leadership has heard of. So pointing out the relationship between these and those really big ground shaking vulnerabilities can help you make the case for improving your cybersecurity hygiene, improving your baseline controls over time. So the first big one, and I'm going to repeat this when we get to ops, I'm going to repeat it probably until I die, is practice minimization with regard to your own code and with regard to your code's dependencies. One of the things I ask before I work on a piece of software is, what is its dependency tree? How many dependencies does it have? If I'm thinking of using a particular library, I want to know what dependencies do I get with that library. The more dependencies you have, the more you're moving from the complicated to the complex, because not one of us has time to vet every change in every dependency of a dependency of a dependency in our software world. We just don't. And that's one of the things that pushes software from complicated to complex. It's not about sort of the shape and size of the software and how we balance not reinventing the wheel with having more dependencies than we can track. It's about the fact that once you have code that is at such a volume that you cannot evaluate it, and we're already all there, unless one of you wants to tell me there is not an operating system in your organization for which you haven't personally reviewed the code, there is not a control system that you haven't reviewed the firmware and the programming for, there isn't an application that you don't know inside and out. I don't think any of us are going to say that. If you can say that, please interrupt me right now and tell me how the heck you did it, because I would love to have that.
Susan?
Yes.
In the development world, how common do you think it is that people do, I put it referred to as cargo cult programming, basically including everything with the kitchen sink, even if they don't need that particular functionality?
I think it's actually something that is more common in academia than it is in the private sector or the broader open source world, and here's why. In many of our cases, the least expensive coders available to us are our own students. Many pieces of software are built without a professional programmer ever being involved in the process, either by academics who have another specialty entirely and they're merely trying to enable their own research or their own teaching, or by students. In both cases, these are people who are looking out at the world and saying, well, what do I think is usually done? What do I see a lot of? And trying to imitate it. Not realizing how custom to a specific piece of software dependency decisions need to be. And so I often see some of this software that is developed by students and by non-software academics that have laundry lists of dependencies, many of which aren't even used. Another thing that affects our having this sort of bloated dependency list problem is that a lot of our code is old. And what I have found is, because we have so few resources to put into maintaining that code, when we work on the code, we're trying to get a new behavior or a new feature from it. And unfortunately, that means that when we have a 40 or 50-year-old code base, which some of us do in our care, it is very unlikely that someone is going back and cleaning up the technical debt. Specifically, they are not cleaning up unused dependencies, something that used to be used and is no longer used. They're not removing it. Or they're not cleaning up theoretically unreachable code. And this is a huge liability for us. I'm going to talk about a very old piece of academically developed software that I did a turnaround for a few years ago. And that's the Network Time Protocol Reference Implementation. For those who don't know, NTP tells the majority of computing systems on the planet what time it is. They can query a server or a network of servers and get their opinion on what time it is. It also has a built-in ability to communicate with something like GPSD, which can pull time from GPS satellites, or other sources that will negotiate between conflicting time signals from different sources to figure out what reality most likely is. NTP is used in banking, cryptography, science, and just the day-to-day of trying to log correctly on your systems. It was originally developed under an NSF grant, and when the grant ran out, it was handed over to a volunteer who took it over long-term. And in the first year from when that volunteer continued to maintain the software the way he always had, and my team began cleaning up the software. Now, mind you, we hadn't made major security changes in the way that people think of hunting down bugs and solving minute security problems at this point. In that first year, we fixed the build system. We removed unused and theoretically unreachable code. We cleaned up the architecture so that we could actually do work on the rest of the program and patch without a lot of cost, things like that. But because these two things were running in parallel with these two different standards of care, it provided an accidental experiment. A professor at another school, not here at IU, decided that great training for her software security students would be to throw them at an old piece of software like NTP and have them report vulnerabilities as fast as they can. Just in practicing minimization, in removing theoretically unreachable or unused code, and cleaning up our build system so that we knew what was actually being included in every build, and getting some minor architectural issues in order, 70% of the 0 days that were reported on this code base, things that came up from a third party that we had no way of knowing it was coming, 70% of them affected the initial code base, but were dodged by us. We were not affected just because we'd practiced minimization. I will preach the cult of minimization in technology until I die. It is amazing. And I'm not giving us credit for any of the security vulnerabilities we found and fixed. I'm saying 70% of the stuff we didn't know was there, we fixed simply by practicing minimization. That is amazing. So when I talk about the power of minimization for code and dependencies, I really do mean it. And I'm saying that from experience. Don't run things you're not actually using. Clean up old things. And so those are the two reasons that minimization and its inverse, the sort of bloated unused dependency list, are so important to be aware of in academia, because we have ancient code, and that code has had time to change its shape enough that it may still have vestigial branches that are no longer used. And also because we have a lot of people generating code who don't do this for a living and who haven't learned all the practicalities of things like the danger of too many dependencies. In case it wasn't obvious where I was going next, after we talk about minimization and limiting your dependencies, I also want to talk about understanding your entire dependency tree. When we were in the midst of the Log4Shell, I don't really want to call it a panic or response, as a wider information technology world, One of the things I found is that developers had to go discover whether or not they were using Log4j. Not all of them knew. And that's pretty scary to me, but it's also not uncommon. We see people who pull in large groups of libraries, especially, like I said, these non-professional programmers who are doing it as an aside to another area of study or work. And when you inherit software from other people, it's very easy not to understand all of the dependency tree. That's a little scary, but once you start spelunking that and finding out what your dependency tree is, it's getting easier and easier to monitor for issues. For software developers, I want to point out that GitHub and GitLab, the two sort of biggest competitors, if you're looking for a third-party Git host, both of them offer features now that will attempt to detect your dependency tree and alert you when one of those dependencies shows that it has a known security vulnerability. So you can make sure that you've updated to only use a secure version of that dependency, or you've made sure that you don't use the dependency in a way that makes you vulnerable to exploit. It's a really great tool. Use it. Pardon me, it doesn't cost anything for open source projects. So if you have code that you use that you rely on, but you're willing to share with anyone else who might need it, that's a good way to get a valuable service for free. The next thing is instrument for fast, reliable builds. One of the things that I see a lot, and we develop a lot of software for ourselves as a scientific community, and I see a lot of the same in academia, but what I see a lot is we're building the thing to get it done, and build automation tends to fall by the wayside in about 60% of cases. I would say the majority of the scientific software that I see on a day-to-day basis does not have a fully automated, obvious to everyone who sits down and works on it, build system where I know that I can write a patch, evaluate and test the patch, get it into the system, and have new builds available to everyone who consumes that software within a couple of hours. That's pretty scary because you could have the answer to the vulnerability impacting all of your users, but not be able to get it to them because you have to dither around with the build system for several hours, which, as most of us don't run 24/7 shops, can turn into several days. So absolutely build instrumentation. It's not that hard to learn. There are a million different tutorials out there, either from the programming language community that you're in, or from whatever you're using in your automation stream. If you already have one, get your build automation down. It really does make a difference because, again, we don't live in a world where we can't expect bugs and vulnerabilities. We need to be able to quickly and reliably rebuild our software. The next thing is to automate distribution and use established channels whenever possible. This is a place where academia often falls down. It is far too easy to fall back to using your own email list as a way to distribute your software and notify people that patches are needed. We have very small software communities. I've personally worked on pieces of software that had, I kid you not, 6 or fewer institutions using it, but we maintained it for them. And what happens in those cases is it's lighter weight, it's less work to use an email list. The problem is we have to hope that the email list was subscribed to by all the right people, that they're checking it often enough. It's really difficult to do that well. So for your server-side software, it is usually appropriate to tap into whatever established channel is being used by your consumers. So if you're distributing this as a Docker container, can it be hosted on something major like Docker Hub, so that they get notified when they need to update? If you're doing something that will be deployed on Linux servers, can you get it in the repos for, at least Red Hat, Debian, Gentoo, which are sort of your biggest ecosystems. Debian sort of gives you Ubuntu. You just repeat the package to another repo. There are both the mainstream repos for this and dedicated academic repos. You can maintain it either way, but using something that makes the path from you as a developer to your user base smooth and automated reduces a lot of error in not patching big things fast enough. The next thing, pair student developers and academics with professional developers wherever possible. I realize that we don't have infinite funds to do this with, and that funding restrictions are part of why we use developers who are students so much. I have a project right now that my staff is managing where we are using student developers. It's difficult. Students can do amazing work, and they can also overlook some of the most basic things like segmenting an application into meaningful parts, so that, for example, the person writing the UI doesn't need to really understand how authentication works. These are things that, with a little bit of intervention from a professional, not spending the money to have the professional develop the software, you can get a much higher quality piece of software for not much more than you're putting into it right now. With our students, we'll often do a situation where they have a security professional or an IT professional checking in with them weekly to go over the things that they're doing. And at a couple of major milestones, usually the end of the planning phase, before real development begins, and maybe once or twice as we get from, early development to beta testing to release, they sit down with a software security person or just an experienced developer and go over what they're doing, what their architecture is, what their build system is, and make sure that it's brought up to the standard it needs to be. On top of this, you're helping your students become more marketable in the workplace. When I talk to my peers, for those who don't know, I was a software engineer and a software architect before I got into information security full time. And when I talk to my peers from those industries and I ask them, what is your frustration with bringing up new programmers? They tell me their education did not include build automation. It did not include adequate testing. It did not include managing distribution of software. It did not include sort of the basic architectural decisions that people creating small and managing small components need to know. And they've missed these meta skills while they're out there learning programming languages and learning algorithms and learning data structures and all of that. They've missed sort of the how to do the job part. So by doing this, you're not just making the software within your university or your science center better, you're taking those students that you're working with and making them more prepared for the workforce, and that's good for everyone. The next thing I want to talk about is incident response planning and security exercises. I know far too many people in the software field who tell me that incident response and security exercises are for ops people. They develop software, it is not their problem, they don't have incidents. This just isn't true. When there is a big vulnerability, every one of us is off at our organization starting an incident. Incident response planning certainly looks different from the perspective of the software development team than from an ops team, but it needs to happen, and you need to practice for these things before they happen. As a software development team, we need to be able to assess and correct a vulnerability in our own software very quickly. We need to be prepared to respond to vulnerabilities in our dependencies. We need to be able to communicate upstream to our dependencies and downstream to the people getting software from us. And we need to figure out who's going to be responsible for ensuring that when we introduce a quick patch to solve an immediate security problem, that we aren't creating new problems. These are all things that get better with planning and practice, especially the practice. When people are in that limelight, especially if you get one of those horrible vulnerabilities that comes with a logo and shows up on the mainstream news being mispronounced by people who don't know how any of their software works or what it's made of, that's a very stressful moment in your life. You don't want to be sitting there seeing this on the news and having everyone you know call and text you to tell you it's on the news while you're trying to put a patch together and then drop something important like not running it through a test suite. This is where practice and automation will save the day. Because we're all going to have that moment when we find out that our code isn't what we intended it to be in this complex world. So let's prepare to respond to it. It's not just ops' job. As a matter of fact, ops cannot begin to do their job in the case of a major vulnerability or any vulnerability until software has done their job. They might be able to manage a workaround. They might be saved by defense in depth. But in the end, I don't expect a sysadmin to go out there, reverse compile the software I sent him, and figure out how to patch it. This is our job in the software world, to be prepared for those types of incidents and to do our part so that ops can take the handoff. So any questions yet from the audience, Adrian?
Not as of yet.
You guys are a very quiet bunch today. I would be very happy if I got some audience questions. I want to make sure that I'm approaching things the way that you're interested in them. And also I'd like to hear what you are doing or what you wish you were doing at your institutions, because this is a place where I feel like we all need to improve, and we all have limitations that we're facing in trying to improve. Mitigations and operations. So just like the mitigations on the software side, you're seeing the same themes addressing those root causes: complexity versus complication. The fact that there are going to be bugs and we should be prepared to respond. The fact that there are resourcing problems around the software that we use. Ops has a different role than software, so the response is going to be a little bit different. But it's going to start with minimization. Someday, one of you is going to wander away and you're going to see the word minimization in a book or a paper you're reading, and you're going to hear it in my voice because I say it so much. But I want that burned into your skull. Minimization. How can I have less to protect? How can I have a smaller attack surface? How can I have less software to manage? How can I have fewer dependencies? How can I have a shorter line from finding a vulnerability to fix it? That often has to do with how deep your dependency tree is. If you have, for example, log4shell, that's already a dependency of some Java applications. In many cases, it was a dependency of a library, which is called by another library, which is in turn in an application that is in an appliance that you installed on your network. That's a lot of jumps, because first we needed a fix from the Log4j team for log4shell. Then the library that was using Log4j had to update. Then the library that depended on that library had to get the fix and had to update. And then as we get further, now the application needs to be updated. And now somehow we have to get that from where it is to a point where someone who's operating that appliance says, oh, it turns out that I have to apply a patch because log4shell impacted this standalone appliance we have in the corner of the office that I don't even, that is mostly a managed appliance. So that's a longer dependency tree. And those are the kind of routes that slow down your response in a way that's outside your control. There's a lot of things you can do in ops. I'm going to talk again about automation. I'm going to talk again about practice. You can't directly control how all of the programmers in your supply chain behave, but you can improve your position by shortening that supply chain, by having less of a long dependency cascade. Include software in your inventory, including the whole dependency tree if you can, or as much as you can assess. I have definitely talked to vendors, and I'll be talking about that later, who cannot tell me the dependency tree of their product in full. That is of deep concern to me. It's hard to maintain an accurate inventory, but every operating system now has some kind of utility where you can dump the packages that you've installed. And send that to a centralized logging or management server, or feed it to an endpoint security client, whatever you've got.
You want comments as well, Susan? Or
Absolutely.
we have a comment from Jody Ito to everyone. Wish we had resources to implement the things you are talking about. Good points, and we'll need to bring up with our developer teams. They'll probably roll their eyes and give a heavy sigh again.
I am not surprised. I think there are a lot of people in academia and in science who are going through this same problem. And part of that is among your developers, there is a belief that if we are doing more security things, it must take more of our time. It will at first. There's a hump to get over, right? But in the end, having instrumentation for fast, reliable builds, for example, I just went back a slide, and automating your distribution, that saves you time. Because yes, you have to learn to use a build system and you have to integrate it with your code, But once you've done that, you no longer have to spend human time on builds. In one organization where I came in as a security person and ultimately as their CISO, we had a certificate management process and it was extremely manual. It was taking us one full FTE just to manage certificates. And this was on a very small team. And I looked at this and I said, we can't afford this. And everyone was in pain at first for about 2 months, because during that 2 months, the time to turn around a new certificate went from an average of about 2 weeks to an average of 3.5 or 4 weeks for 2 months. And by the end of that 2 months, we had automated the majority of the process. And now we were turning around certificates in a matter of hours. And it became a part-time task that was shared by the security team. And we no longer had to bleed a third of our security effort just to certificate management.
I got a comment.
Go for it.
I believe this is from Scott Finley. Besides saying +1 to a previous comment, I was given a document showing all of the frameworks and tools being used in IAM type activities. I think dependencies are like over 100 things.
That is quite likely. We can't control that yet in all of our vendors, but we can start controlling it within our own teams. You'll find many dependencies are optional dependencies. They can be disabled. You'll also find that one of the signs of something that you may not want to adopt is something that has 100 dependencies when its competitor has 4. None of this is going to be perfect, but we can do what we can do. And there are a lot of people who look at the perfect state and say, I can't get there, so I'm not going to do this. Don't get to perfect. Start by 2%. If you do 2% and you improve all year, 2% per week, maybe improvement on sucking down, minimizing, having less stuff, or on instrumenting something that wasn't instrumented before, very quickly you get accelerating gains. Within a year or 2 or 3, you are so much closer to that desired end state than you ever thought you could get. And honestly, you might be good enough. You might just need to continue on that path. But what I see is it's so hard to get to the ideal end state that people don't want to start. You know, automating builds, automate 1 build per week. You know, it's a couple hours of somebody's time. And then the next one will be a couple hours of somebody's time. But if you're doing 1 per week, eventually you get through most of your in-house developed software stack.
Hey, Susan.
Yes.
Just wanted to jump in. I'm not quite sure if it's just on my end, but if you have your screen share still going, I only see your cursor right now in a black screen.
Uh-oh. Can anyone else not see it?
I can see your slides, but I might be special.
All fine. Okay, it sounds like it's just me for some reason. So thank you.
Yeah, Scott said it. He can see it.
Okay. I suggest you might want to quit and rejoin every once in a while. That'll solve the Zoom video bugs.
Great, thanks.
For anyone who scanned the suspicious QR code that Adrian presented, this is at the end of that same slide deck. So you can also watch along at home if you prefer to do it that way. So yes, I absolutely get that this seems unreal to a lot of developers in our environments. One thing that can make a massive difference is if you can bring someone in, even on a consulting basis, who has experience with build systems and automation. What I've found is because academia and science got computers and software earlier than everyone else. You guys have been doing this a really long time. If not you personally, then whoever your predecessor at your organization is, or someone in the community you operate in has been doing this for a very, very long time. We have a lot of people who spend their entire careers in academia or science. They like it there. It's a lifestyle. It's a community they've become comfortable with. So all of these tools are so far outside their experience that when we're talking about how fast it is to automate a build, they're baking in all of the years of learning how to do this that they're afraid they're going to have to do. And if you bring in one person who's comfortable enough with these systems, knows enough about them to say, no, you don't have to learn every possible system and choose one. Here's one that's reasonable for everything we do. We're going to implement it. I'm going to help you. That greatly lowers the pressure on the development team, because when you've been developing without these types of automation for a really long time, onboarding to it is a daunting learning process. And having somebody create that on-ramp for you is incredibly empowering. Because all of a sudden tasks that you did every day take less of your time, which is great. Everyone likes that. But you were spared sort of not just the idea of I need to learn a tool and use it, but I need to learn every possible tool so I know which tool to use. I hope that helps address that for some people. I know that this is still an uphill battle, but I think it's one that's worth fighting. Back to operations, minimization, definitely. Try to run fewer things. A lot of this has to do with negotiation. I know that we all have different levels of how centralized or distributed our IT decision-making is. If you have Slack, have everybody use Slack. Don't have 6 different chat servers if you don't need to manage them, because now you have 6 times the possibility that something bad will happen to one of them in any given day. Try to consolidate in those ways when you can. It's not always practical, but you can get smaller than you were before. Include software in your inventory. I know as a community, we're often struggling with asset inventory. And many people try to inventory the systems and the services, but don't get down to software. This can save you an incredible amount of time when you don't have to do discovery because you already know what software you're running when a vulnerability comes out. It'll never be perfect. Get as much as you can. Finding that whole dependency tree is hard. I can, off the top of my head, name 3 or 4 different times when I have called a vendor to find out what the dependency tree is for their own software, and they either cannot or will not tell me. So I know that's a tough one, but having some is better than having none. Automate where you can for fast, reliable patching and updates. I have to say, Wade Craig in our last talk, if you missed it, get the recording. He talked about how, yes, we use different systems for Windows and Linux patching, and then we use a third system to confirm that patches have been applied. But with that, they can ensure that patching will happen in a timely manner. Another thing that they've done is gone for redundancy throughout their environment, whether that's through virtualization, through having multiple compute nodes that can be updated independently in a cluster, things like that. It means that you can patch sooner with less impact on your organization. Defense in depth, always. And I'm going to talk about stacked security vulnerabilities in a bit here. I love defense in depth because it means that it's less likely that when I inevitably have a vulnerability that it can hurt me. That means limiting access to software appropriately. Not everything needs to be open to the whole internet. Monitoring comprehensively, and this is a big one. If you know you have a vulnerability sitting there and you just can't remediate it right now, that shouldn't ever happen, but none of us live in the world of perfect. That will happen to you someday. If you are monitoring, not just north-south, but also east-west traffic, if you are alerting on not just known indicators of compromise, but also on unexpected traffic patterns that simply don't match how things are supposed to work in your network. And of course, prevention measures. You can make sure that anything that's new and being tested isn't on the same network as your crown jewels, as things that are in production and need to be carefully protected. All of those things help. A lot of, a lot of the time, I remember the second project I worked on back when I was on Trusted CI, and second or third, and we started interviewing people at a particular major facility. And what I heard from the ops people, from the software development people, from all of the groups outside of the security group was, we don't have to worry about that. The firewall protects us. As a matter of fact, we sent a drawing of the magic firewall to their CISO after the engagement and the interviews, because this had become such an ongoing thing. For too long, our organizations have been engaged in sort of eggshell security, where there's supposedly something hard to penetrate on the outside and the inside is soft and vulnerable. It's just not something that we can justify, because we've learned, whatever firewall platform you use, it or one of its dependencies will someday have a bug. And you can get away with a lot more if you're monitoring comprehensively, if you'll be alerted to a problem quickly, than you can if nobody's looking at your network. And I found that for many of us, well, I should say for many in the science and higher ed community, I think that with this being a ResearchSOC event following an OmniSOC event, we may have an awful lot of people here with monitoring in place. But for the rest of the world, monitoring in higher ed and science is often limited or not present at all. And that's something where every vulnerability becomes more of a danger, because you won't find out when someone begins to exploit it. And of course, incident response planning and regular security exercises. I think most of you are doing this by now. I think when most ops teams are justifying the time that they spend on this, one of the things they often don't remember to say is, and by the way, whenever there's one of these vulnerabilities, we know how to deal with it swiftly and correctly because we've been practicing it. I'm a big fan of leveraging the things that we actually see on the news to help non-technical stakeholders understand why we do what we do. None of these mitigations are easy, but many of them are very doable, especially when you have an opportunity to automate. I'm going to get on to mental models here unless there are any questions. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, a mental model is sort of an arrangement of factors and how they relate to one another or how they work in the world. It is the most direct way we know to take knowledge out of one person's brain and matrix style put it in another person's brain so that they can't just relate facts, but they can actually use what they've learned right away. I'm going to share with you a handful of mental models that I use to try to deal with these issues and protect us from the next log4shell or the next thing that comes up. And one of them is that open source software isn't free as in freedom or free as in beer, as you'll hear the Raymond devotees and the Stallman devotees argue about at times. It's free as in a free puppy. The children you see here are two of the three adorable daughters of one of my coworkers, Josh Drake. I used the photo with his permission, and they got a puppy recently. And the thing is, if you get a puppy, even if it's a free puppy, that puppy is going to cost you. It's going to cost you your time. You're going to need to play with the puppy and walk the puppy and clean up after the puppy. You're going to be spending money. There are going to be vet bills, and puppy food isn't free, and you're going to need toys for the puppy and a place for the puppy to sleep. In this case, you see them in a puppy playpen because this particular puppy hasn't learned to be on her own and not chew up the house yet. When we adopt open source software, we often put down its cost as zero. Even when we haven't paid for so much as a support contract. In my opinion, one of the best things we can do is actually catalog reasonable expected costs for open source software at time of adoption, so that our organizations know what they're getting into. Often we hear we did it with free software because we didn't have a budget, but what you did was end up spending half an FTE on this, which is going to cost you, depending on what your FTE is paid, maybe $120,000 a year after benefits and everything. And then, okay, we're going to do that. And then now we're spending all this time that's more expensive than getting a different option. Or that maintenance just goes undone and you don't get the benefit from the tool. The number of people I've set up for onboarding to get them started to use something like ResearchSOC and found out that, yes, they have a SIEM and they're very proud that they have a SIEM, but nobody has time to look at the SIEM because nobody's funded to work on the SIEM. So they haven't written any rules and they don't watch the SIEM. And I'm glad that those people are coming to us because it's something we're well suited to help with. But whether you're adopting a vendor provided sold product or something free from the open source world, you have to look at the puppy factor. You have to look at what does it take to actually work with this enough to get benefit from it? What does it take to administer this? What does it take to deal with vulnerabilities? Those aren't realistically part of our balance sheets. They tend to kind of just get hand waved away. And these are significant costs that hit our software development departments, our ops folks, our security folks. And it's because people say free software a lot, and it is very much like a free puppy. The next mental model I want to show you is black swans and gray pigeons. We've got some content looking pigeons over here in a photo. We've all heard the expression black swan. This is that devastating thing that is unlikely, but it poses an existential threat to your organization. It could take the whole organization down. And we spend a lot of time in security talking about our black swans. And usually after the discussion of black swans is done, people say, well, what's the next unlikely thing that's a little less bad than the black swan? I'm going to urge you not to do that. I'm going to urge you to make your top 2 priorities your black swans and your gray pigeons. Whereas a black swan is devastating and rare, a gray pigeon is exceedingly common, and each one doesn't cost you very much. The problem is there are thousands of them, and they will constantly show up, squawk at you, take your time, and perhaps defecate on your work and then leave. Or not leave, you know, they might hang around and try to beg for food. 1,000 pigeons raining down on your work isn't good, because you can no longer be a proactive security person if you're spending all your time on the gray pigeons. So this is a place where if you see a gray pigeon, if you see something that's costing you your time, your attention, your ability to operate, that needs to be automated. Either find a way to automate it or find a way to make it such a concrete process that it can be done quickly and at a minimal cost. I think that especially throughout the pandemic times, as we've all had more gray pigeons in our life, more just day-to-day disruptions. I don't know about you folks, but for those of us in Southern Indiana, the school system has decided that remote learning is the answer to every concern that they have. And it rained last night. It was cold today. And so someone was concerned that the roads would be icy. So all the kids in the district are on remote learning. That's become a gray pigeon disruption to a lot of people's days. We talk more about black swans than gray pigeons, and I really want to focus on the number of gray pigeons that affect our work. Like when it's difficult to remediate a vulnerability because we don't know where we have that software. The inverse of defense in depth is stacked vulnerabilities. The concept of defense in depth is that, you know, okay, my firewall is going to stop some bad people, and we have black hole routing to make sure that that gets, you know, updated according to what's hitting our honeypot or something like that. So we've got a layer here. And then I have perhaps a web application firewall that's doing some work here. And then I have network segregation that should keep anyone from the outside from hitting this one very precious and fragile server I have. And then hopefully the precious and fragile server is being monitored. It's also been hardened as much as we can manage to reduce its attack surface. We have all these defenses so that more than one thing has to go wrong in order for us to get attacked. And I think we're all pretty happy that we have that at this point. Looking at the list of people attending this meeting, those of you that I know your organization, you have at least some defense in depth in play. The problem is when I know a lot of organizations in higher ed and in science have a policy of not patching any vulnerability that is not rated critical or high. And I get it. Those are the worst too. That's how much resource you think you have to put into it. That's how much downtime you think people can accept. The problem is that something that is a medium or low vulnerability is a medium or low vulnerability on its own, perhaps because of that defense in depth. But now you have another medium or low vulnerability that interacts with that first one, and then a third one and a fourth one. And as these things begin to stack, begin to accumulate, they can start to create an attack path. They can create a failure that you wouldn't have had otherwise. That's one of the things that happens in complex systems. Is it's not just that your systems get to interact. It's not just that the benefits we get from things like defense in depth come together and form synergies, bad things can form synergies too. That said, I know that we can't jump on any little thing that gets reported in the world because there's just too much of it. But seriously consider, one of the options that one of my projects has used is they patch high and critical vulnerabilities immediately, but they do a monthly cycle where on that monthly cycle, they remediate everything they can as far down the list as possible, including the mediums and occasionally the lows. This helps them a great deal for a couple of reasons. First of all, what I said about the accumulation of vulnerabilities and complex systems and how that can create something more severe than any of them was on their own. But also all of the intelligence that you are being fed by the world, the things that you get from your vendors, the things that you get from, Storm Center, the things that you get from me and my folks at ResearchSOC and OmniSOC. This is based on the idea that you are running a still supported version and patch level of your software, because we can't possibly go through and do independent research that the software developers aren't doing on things that have hit end of life. But when you're running a great deal of end of life software or ancient patch levels, what happens is you're now accumulating unknowns and you're moving further and further down the road from complicated or maybe a little complex to entirely complex, because now you have a whole bunch of software that is outside the range of what the security community at large is looking at. And that's pretty scary to me. It is important to do updates. It is important to run current software. I feel like we say this a lot, and I feel like, there is a necessity to accept risk at times, but you need to be aware of the fact that stacked vulnerabilities are a thing. This is a feature of the complex system that is our software security world. 3 mediums might make it critical, but you won't find out because everyone else has patched the mediums already. And that's the last point that I really wanted to make. The quality of your threat intel that you can get from the rest of the world so that you can understand your own security posture goes down as your patch tempo goes down. The private sector, I hate to say it, is extremely varied. I love to extol, this is how they do it in the private sector. We should do it like they do it. I've seen the private sector be a range from we don't have anyone here who knows how to patch, to we're patching things before the vulnerability is officially announced publicly. There's a whole range here. And we have a pretty big range here in academia and in science. But threat researchers mostly work for the expensive folks who have that high patch tempo. So what happens is there are a whole bunch of people whose entire career is understanding the threat landscape. And many of them are willing to share their information with you through Storm Center, through US CERT, through ICS CERT, through ResearchSOC, through Trusted CI, through all of these different organizations and all of these different outlets. But those researchers are usually working on fairly recent versions of software. Because the people who pay them only care about the recent stuff, their patch tempo tends to be very high. And also because you don't get any career progression for finding a bug in something that's been end of life, that's no longer considered relevant by the industry. So where you should have a warning here of, hey, a cow's going to cross the road and that's the thing that'll actually happen to you, you may be hearing fear of alien abduction. Not because alien abduction is likely to happen to you, but because everybody who's paying a threat researcher already got all the cows off their road. Again, I'm not pushing for everyone to be perfect. I'm talking about being aware that there are trade-offs in not patching lower level vulnerabilities. Can we improve the status quo? A lot of our challenges come from the fact that our commercial and open source software supply chains are not what we wish they were. And one of the 3 root causes I talked about is that the resources and incentives for the people making this software that we all consume are a little bit broken. So I'm going to offer you two strategies that can really help improve the status quo for everyone, as well as helping your organization. In your commercial supply chain, start asking hard questions about their software development practices, their dependencies, and their vulnerability management during selection and contracting. Once they already have a contract and you have to pay them money, they're going to be a lot less interested in responding to your inquiries. Sometimes we're trying to do something very specialized for which there's really only one provider and they've got us. They have that monopoly power. But sometimes there are 8 providers, and by asking those questions, you make them rethink about whether security and minimization and responsible handling of software should be part of their value proposition. And it absolutely should. But depending on what software company I go to, this one tells me that security is something they push forward as a feature. This other company is saying, my customers never ask me about security. They want features. The next thing is see if you can manage your open source software risk by following the 10% rule. This is something that most major software companies picked up, about 20 years ago, in the early 2000s. I first started hearing about it in 2001, 2002. But what they do is they donate 10% of their developer time to assisting in the maintenance of the things that they depend on in the open source world. That sounds really hard to do, but that is 4 hours of a programmer's 40-hour week. If you can do that, if you are in a position to do that, it accomplishes a couple of things. First of all, it gives you the opportunity to route some effort to things that are less sexy, but if they went wrong, it would be at a high cost. It helps you develop your programmers by getting them in constant contact with people who are out there and doing programming in either more demanding environments or more varied ones, so they can bring back lessons learned that aren't obvious within the bubble of your organization. Especially since none of us primarily run software organizations. Each one of us is trying to do something else. We're trying to educate, we're trying to do research. We're trying to do those sorts of things, and software is an aside. So this is also a professional development opportunity for the software people who aren't working in the software industry. If you can't donate development time, try to create a budget for the things that you depend on or offer code bounties. These strategies help your organization. They also help improve the state for everyone. I think most of us have gotten to the point where we're not crippled when something like Log4Shell comes out. Nobody likes it. It's not fun. But we know what to do about it. We know how to find problems. We know how to get them patched. What I'm hoping is that we will stop looking at each one of these as they come and go as something that is a one-off. We've had enough years of a steady stream of these that we know we're going to have between 1 and 5 of them every year, and we should be prepared for it. We can't prevent them all. I love minimization. I love improving coding. As I said at the beginning of this, I don't believe anyone in this audience can afford zero defect programming as a strategy. I love it. It's very difficult and expensive to do. But we live in a world where we can manage the things that we need to manage and make things better for our organization. So we are very, very near to our stop time. I want to thank everyone who attended. I would love to get your feedback or your questions. We have a few minutes left to take that. I'll do my best to answer any questions. You can also reach out to us, rsoc@iu.edu, or to me personally, sesons@iu.edu. And thank you, Adrian, for playing moderator and telling me what's in the chat.
No problem. Scott says thank you. Pardon me. Scott says thank you all. Jody asks, where will you be posting the recording? I'd love to share this with our teams. Thank you very much for this.
So this will eventually be on the ResearchSOC website. It usually takes a few days when we have 3 days of content to throw at them for all of the captioning and everything to do for this to get posted. But you can look at the YouTube channel for ResearchSOC, or you can look at researchsoc.iu.edu at the blog, and these will get posted within a few days.